Are these 1,000 pages of science fiction a complete slog, or an absolute masterpiece? Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. And in today's video, I'm going to be discussing Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton, the first book in the Commonwealth Saga duology. So let's get into the premise. In the year 2380, the intersolar Commonwealth spans over 400 light years and contains over 600 worlds. One day, over 1,000 light years away, a star vanishes. So a starship is built, a crew is assembled to set out on a mission to find out what exactly happened and why. So the first thing I want to talk about is the style, as I think this book does lean towards the harder end of sci-fi. There are a fair amount of technologies and scientific concepts that Hamilton introduces and explores, and those do come along with some technical descriptions. I wouldn't say that this reads like a physics textbook where you get bogged down with pages and pages of description, but you will sometimes get paragraphs of description every now and then throughout the book. If you're looking for a comparison of how hard the sci-fi is, along the spectrum, I would probably put this somewhere near a Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke if you happen to have read that one. Now, if you're someone that doesn't read a lot of hard sci-fi, I do want to let you know that there is one storyline. There's quite a lot of storylines in this book, but there is one storyline that to me had a bit more of a fantasy type feel to it. So that does only account for maybe around 10 or 15% of the book. So it's definitely not the majority, but it might be that one thread that kind of pulls you along and helps keep you going as you get adjusted to the more hard sci-fi style, because I think once you get introduced to a lot of the terms and the concepts, then you can really immerse yourself in this pretty epic world. I think this is a unique book, and I haven't thought of a single book to compare it to, but if you're looking for a bit of a sense of the style, I would say that the near future setting reminded me a little bit of The Expanse, but it leans a lot more heavily into the science and the concepts, which reminded me of the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. However, as a writer, I don't think Hamilton is particularly similar to either of those. The writer that Hamilton reminded me of would be Alastair Reynolds, but without a word limit. I think if you're a fan of Alastair Reynolds, you're not going to find Hamilton's writing the same, but I think there will be some elements that have some crossover appeal. As a book with a rather distinct style, I think this one has some rather strong 1-star, 5-star potential. When I talked about this book in my September TBR video, I had a few commenters say that they absolutely love this book, and I had a few people that said it was a rather big disappointment. So let me know if you read it. I'm interested to see the reactions and get your guys' take on it. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the concept, because this book has some very cool sci-fi ideas. I'll just mention a couple of them to give you a quick taste. No spoilers, these are introduced in the first 50 to 100 pages and are mentioned in the blurb on the back of the book. So the first one that I thought was pretty interesting was the idea of wormholes. So this is not a new idea, but I think what Hamilton has as a strength as a writer is not just introducing new technologies, but really exploring the implications of those technologies. So he does spend a little bit of time explaining how they work, but the level of detail that he goes to explore and examine how that would affect society, how different individuals would use them differently, I think is really well done. So if you like those kind of thought experiments, answering those what-if questions, then I think Hamilton might be a writer that appeals to you. The second concept that I thought was really cool was this idea of a disappearing star. So that's part of the premise that really hooked me in, and it's this mystery that had me turning through the pages. I love those big scale ideas that have you asking questions like, how is that scientifically possible? Why did it happen? And what does that mean for us? And I do want to single out one chapter in particular. I'm not going to tell you what it's about, but it absolutely blew me away. And it came at a perfect point in the story because it was at a time where the book was just starting to lose my interest a little bit, and then I got hit with what I honestly think is one of the best chapters that I've ever read. I would never recommend just skipping the book to read this chapter, but if you are telling me, Jonathan, there is a 0 chance I'm ever going to pick up this book, I think you could actually read this chapter in isolation and get a lot out of it. If you have read the book, I'm pretty sure you know the chapter that I'm talking about, so jump in the Discord server and we can go nuts over it. Moving on, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the world building, because this book has a ton of planets, locations, technologies, characters, stories, places, people, science, culture, politics. There is so much crammed into this book And if you are looking for an epic story, you have read a bunch of sci-fi books and it's like, okay, yeah, we hop around a couple of planets here to here to here. Let's really ramp up the scale. Then I think this is definitely going to be a sci-fi book that could land for you. I think this is potentially the most ambitious sci-fi story that I've read, and so far I'm still only halfway through. One thing that I thought was really well done in the first half of the book was the intersolar politics. I found it really interesting to learn out about who has the power and what is the kind of systems and structures that are in place and who are the people trying to influence that power and how. However, later in the book, as the scale of the story grew and the scope of the ideas and the concepts increased, the politics started to become a little bit less interesting to me. And perhaps that was intentional, a commentary on the relative importance of things, but later those chapters just started to hold my interest a little bit less. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the characters, because there are quite a lot of them in Pandora's Star. I think that Hamilton is a reasonably strong character writer. There were a couple in particular that stood out and were quite interesting to follow. I think the book does focus more on plot development and exploring the concepts than it does developing the characters, although there are a few which take some rather interesting journeys. The rest, which were slightly less engaging to me, I felt like they still serviced the story, and there was only one group of characters that didn't hold my interest quite as much, and I enjoyed their chapters slightly less than the others. In the first 300 pages, we do bounce around a lot, and we are introduced to quite a lot of characters, which could be a little bit disorienting, but from that point onwards, while we might get introduced to some more characters, definitely not at the same pace, and it becomes a little bit easier to keep track of everyone. Once each character has had 2 or 3 chapters, things start to fall into place. So I think you might be able to follow things a little bit easier if you can push past that around 300 page mark and start to get invested in each of those individual characters. Are there too many characters? Well, ultimately I would say no, because while early in the story, it does kind of seem like a lot of these things are unrelated. For me, I felt like in the end, each of these characters served a purpose. How engaging or interesting each of those purposes will vary from reader to reader, but I think in the end, there is a reason for all of those characters to be there. So next, I wanted to talk about the length. This is the longest book that I have read this year. And in my opinion, this is an epic story. It is not just a simple story that has been stretched out or padded out to get to 1,000 pages. However, I will admit that it is quite heavy on the descriptions. Could this 1,000 page book have been trimmed down to 800 pages? Yes, absolutely. Could it have been trimmed down to 600 pages? Possibly, if it was very tight. Could it have been trimmed down to 400 pages? No, absolutely not. There is a lot going on here, and it did need to be a rather large book in order to, I think, achieve all of the things that Hamilton set out to do. So that begs the question, did I enjoy reading all 1,000 pages? Well, if you've seen my reviews for Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio, you'll know that those pages are around 700 to 800 pages, and I think that they could have been cut down to around 500 or 600, but I never got tired of reading those books because I think the pacing of the plot development, character development, and world building was really, really well done. It always held my interest. And also, Rocchio's prose is just so beautiful that I could read him write about pretty much anything. When it comes to Peter F. Hamilton, I think his prose is relatively strong and it does service the story that he's trying to tell. But would I read Hamilton write about anything? No. There were a few times while reading the book that I did kind of want to get back to the story development and exploring those really cool sci-fi concepts. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a duology, and some of you may be interested in my opinion on whether this is part 1 of 2 stories, or whether this is just the first half of 1 story. So if I were to compare it to some other duologies that I've read, Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion, personally I feel like they form 1 story arc, and the ending of Hyperion to me felt like I was halfway through the story. Whereas Teixcalan by Arkady Martin, while it does have an arc that goes across both of the books, there is also a self-contained story that I feel like comes to a relatively satisfying breaking point in book 1, and then book 2 introduces something new. So which of those do I think that Pandora's Star is more similar to? For me, I feel like this is the first half of 1 story. To me, it did feel like a cliffhanger ending. So if you're someone that's a bit of a completionist like I am, I don't think you could just read the first book and be satisfied. I think you're probably going to want to commit to reading both books in the duology. So that leaves the question, will I be continuing the duology? And the answer to that is yes. Because one, I do want to find out what happens in the rest of this story. And two, because I have a suspicion that the aspects that I enjoyed most of in book one, that we're going to be getting even more of those in book two. So fingers crossed for that. So just quickly, before I give my final rating, I wanted to give a massive shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. You guys are awesome. I just launched my Discord server and Patreon membership, so if you're interested in learning more about those, you can check out the links in the description. So what is my final rating for Pandora's Star? Well, I went back and forth on this one a lot, because the high points of this book are so incredibly high. Honestly, some of my favorite sci-fi concepts, some of the best sci-fi writing that I have ever read. However, there were times where this book did start to lose my interest just a little bit, and I found the ending to be a tiny bit underwhelming. I know it's only book one of the duology, but for something as massive and epic as this, I was just hoping for the ending to be a tiny bit more rewarding than it was, but I'm still very much looking forward to reading book two. So putting all of that together, my score for Pandora's Star is going to be an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it, and I think there's going to be a particular type of sci-fi reader that will absolutely love this. I rarely do this, but I might consider bumping that score up later based on my reactions after having read Judas Unchained, because I think if that does build to something great, then book one deserves some of the credit for that. So I'm interested to see, we'll see what happens after I read book two. So those are my thoughts on Pandora's Star. Let me know yours in the comments or on Discord. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, consider becoming a patron, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.